As lawmakers put their final touches on the budget last week, they passed dozens of other bills in a late-night session that are now heading to the governor's desk. One bill would increase the amount of money paid to people who have been wrongfully imprisoned in Illinois and bring the state in line with federally recommended minimum standard set in 2004. Another would ban the construction or operation of new immigration detention centers within 1,500 feet of any home, school, daycare center, park, forest preserve, cemetery, or place of worship. Also included is a bill aimed at giving high schoolers the chance to register to vote in school, named for voting rights activist Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr.